August 20th, 1939. 0545 hours. Khalkhin Gol River, Mongolia. Captain Masanobu Tsuji of the Japanese Kwantung Army crouched in his observation post, watching the horizon through field glasses as the sun began its climb over the Mongolian steppe. The temperature already approached 90 degrees Fahrenheit, promising another scorching day on terrain that seemed designed to kill soldiers. Endless grassland broken by gullies, dry riverbeds, and the occasional rocky outcrop offering minimal cover. Then the earth erupted. 557 Soviet aircraft appeared simultaneously across a 45-mile front. Behind them, massed artillery, over 500 guns, opened fire in a coordinated barrage that represented the most sophisticated combined arms assault yet seen in military history. The ground literally shook as thousands of shells impacted Japanese positions in the span of minutes. Tsuji watched in horror as a new kind of warfare unfolded before him. This wasn't the infantry-centric combat that had defined Japanese military doctrine for decades. This was mechanized total war, artillery, aviation, and armor coordinated through radio networks to deliver overwhelming firepower at the point of decision. What Captain Tsuji witnessed was the future of warfare. Within hours, Soviet forces, including 498 BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank divisions, and over 550 fighters and bombers, would execute a double envelopment that would destroy the Japanese 23rd Division and change the course of World War II before it even began. This is the story of the frozen hell. The Soviet-Japanese border conflicts of 1938-1939 that tested 2 military philosophies, 2 industrial systems, and 2 theories of modern warfare. It's about how tactics evolved under fire, how technology shaped battlefield outcomes, and how the lessons learned in Mongolia's wastelands would echo across the Pacific War and the Eastern Front. The collision of doctrines. To understand what happened at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, you must first understand that 2 fundamentally incompatible military philosophies were about to collide on the Mongolian steppe. The Japanese military doctrine, codified in the 1928 Field Service Code, emphasized spiritual superiority over material advantage. The code proclaimed that the spirit of the Japanese soldier excels that of any other nation. Combat training focused on aggressive offensive action, night attacks, bayonet charges, and the cultivation of fighting spirit, seishin, that would supposedly overcome any material disadvantage. Japanese weapon systems and unit-level strategy centered around the aggressive tactics of the rifleman's platoon, supported by mortar fire and anti-tank artillery pieces. Doctrine held that tanks were to be used in small numbers, piecemeal as shock or support units, covering the advance of infantrymen from a distance of around 3 miles using advance and fire techniques. The Japanese Type 38 rifle, a 6.5mm bolt-action weapon adopted in 1905, remained the standard infantry arm. It was reliable, accurate, and hopelessly outdated for modern warfare. Japanese infantry squads built tactics around this weapon, supplemented by the Type 11 light machine gun, a peculiar weapon that fed from the soldiers' rifle clips inserted into a hopper magazine, limiting sustained fire capability. Japanese anti-tank doctrine in 1938 relied primarily on the Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun, a weapon that could penetrate 45mm of armor at 500 meters under ideal conditions. Against the Soviet T-26 and BT series tanks, this was theoretically adequate. In practice, Japanese anti-tank training was described by their own officers as a weak spot. Soviet doctrine, by contrast, had evolved rapidly through brutal experience in the Russian Civil War and technical exchange with Germany's clandestine military programs in the 1920s. By 1936, the Soviets had developed deep battle theory, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky's concept of simultaneous operations in depth, using mechanized forces to penetrate enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs, while aviation and artillery isolated the breakthrough zone. The theory required combined arms coordination at a level never attempted in warfare, tanks advancing under artillery cover, supported by close air support, with mechanized infantry exploiting breakthroughs and cavalry screening flanks. Radio communication was essential. So was numerical superiority in key sectors. Most critically, it demanded junior officers capable of independent action within a larger operational framework. The Soviets possessed the BT series of fast tanks, cavalry tanks, descended from American designer J. Walter Christie's innovative suspension system. The BT-7, produced from 1935-1940, was armed with a 45mm 20K gun and coaxial machine gun, powered by a Mikulin M17T V12 engine producing 500 horsepower, giving it a top road speed of 53 mph, faster than most contemporary automobiles. The BT designation meant Bystrokodny Tankov, fast tank. The BT-7 weighed approximately 14 tons, carried 44 rounds of 45mm ammunition and 2,394 rounds of 7.62mm machine gun ammunition. The 45mm gun could penetrate 43mm of armor at 500 meters with standard AP rounds, more than sufficient against Japanese armor of the period. But the Soviets' most significant advantage wasn't any single weapon system, it was logistics. While Japanese forces in Manchuria relied primarily on horse-drawn transport and railways, Zhukov effectively made use of a 2,600-truck fleet to bring food and ammunition to the front, while the Japanese lacked motored transport. This seemingly mundane advantage would prove decisive. Lake Khasan. The prologue. The first serious test of these competing doctrines came in July 1938 at Lake Khasan, near Vladivostok, where a disputed border hill became the flashpoint for mechanized warfare. The conflict started on 15 July, when the Japanese attaché in Moscow demanded the removal of Soviet border troops from the Bezymyanaia and Zaozyornaya hills, claiming the territory belonged to Manchukuo based on interpretations of 19th century treaties. The tactical situation favored defense. The left coast of Manchuria is sloping, but the west coast of Mongolia is steep at 75 degrees, which made it difficult for the Japanese to advance. The western bank was particularly unprofitable because it was higher than the east coast. Yet Japanese doctrine demanded offensive action. On July 29, 1938, Japanese forces attacked. The assault force included elements of the 19th Division, experienced troops from the China campaign, supported by artillery and close air support from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. The Japanese infantry tactics were textbook: night approach, march, surprise assault at dawn, aggressive exploitation with bayonet charges. They drove Soviet border troops from the heights, establishing defensive positions and preparing to repel the inevitable counterattack. The Soviets spent 3 days assembling overwhelming force. The Soviets gathered 354 tanks and assault guns at Lake Khasan, including 257 T-26 tanks, with 10 Keach T-26 flame-throwing tanks, 3 ST-26 bridge-laying tanks, 81 BT-7 light tanks, and 13 Su-52 self-propelled guns. The T-26 light tank, derived from the British Vickers 6-ton, was the most numerous tank in Soviet service, weighing 10.5 tons, armed with a 45mm 20K gun and two 7.62mm machine guns, with armor ranging from 15mm to 25mm. The T-26 was intended as an infantry support weapon. Its mechanical reliability was questionable. The Soviet tank force suffered high breakdown rates, but in massed formations, mechanical failures could be absorbed. When the Soviet counterattack came on August 2-3, it demonstrated the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. Soviet artillery fired over 15,000 shells in the preparatory bombardment. Waves of aircraft struck Japanese positions. Then the armor rolled forward, hundreds of tanks advancing in formation while infantry followed in support. Japanese anti-tank guns engaged Soviet armor at maximum range. The Type 94 37mm gun could stop a T-26 with a well-placed shot penetrating the thin armor, but Soviet tactics minimized exposure. Tanks advanced in mutually supporting groups, suppressing anti-tank positions with machine gun fire, while other tanks maneuvered for flanking shots. Among the merits were use of different tactics to destroy enemies' weapons in the rear of the battlefield. Heroism of the sappers who fought face-to-face against tanks. Japanese soldiers attacked tanks with improvised weapons, magnetic mines, demolition charges, even soldiers who threw themselves under tank treads with grenades. This suicidal courage was tactically irrelevant against massed armor. The Kochi 26 flamethrower tanks proved particularly terrifying. With a range of 60 to 70 meters, they could project burning fuel into Japanese entrenchments, forcing defenders from positions that artillery had failed to dislodge. The psychological effect was immense. Japanese troops, conditioned to fear nothing, learned to fear Soviet flame tanks. After 10 days of fighting, the Soviets held the hills. The Japanese suffered 17,000 casualties, while the Soviets lost 10,000 men. But casualties only told part of the story. The battle revealed that Japanese infantry-centric doctrine was obsolete against combined arms mechanized warfare. Japanese after-action reports identified critical weaknesses: inadequate anti-tank weapons, poor coordination between arms, insufficient motorized transport, and most damningly, tactical doctrine that emphasized courage over firepower. These lessons would be largely ignored. The build-up to Khalkhin Gol. The border dispute that would escalate into Khalkhin Gol began absurdly with horses grazing. On 11 May 1939, a Mongolian cavalry unit of some 70 to 90 men had entered the disputed area in search of grazing for their horses. On that day, Manchu cavalry attacked the Mongolians and drove them back across the river Khalkhin Gol. The border dispute was genuine. Japan claimed the Khalkhin Gol River formed the boundary between Manchukuo and Mongolia. The Soviets and Mongolians claimed the border ran 16 kilometers east of the river. The difference encompassed strategically worthless scrubland, but principle mattered more than practicality in 1939. On 13 May, the Mongolian force returned in greater numbers, and the Manchukuoans failed to dislodge them. On 14 May, Lieutenant Kol Yaozo Azuma led the reconnaissance regiment of the 23rd Infantry Division, supported by the 64th Infantry Regiment, into the territory, and the Mongolians withdrew. The Kwantung Army, Japan's occupation force in Manchuria, operated with dangerous autonomy from Tokyo. Its aggressive staff officers, members of the Strike North faction, saw opportunity in the border incident. If successful operations could sever the Trans-Siberian Railway, Soviet Far Eastern forces would be isolated. Mongolia and Siberia could be seized, providing resources for the ongoing China campaign. However, the western region of Manchukuo was garrisoned by the relatively newly formed 23rd Infantry Division at Haila under General Michitaro Komatsubara. The 23rd was the newest and least experienced division in the entire Kwantung Army. Japanese Army experts rated the combat capability of the 23rd Division as below medium, comparable to a garrison division on occupation duty in China. The 23rd Division's equipment reflected its low priority. Artillery consisted primarily of the Type 38 75mm field gun, a World War I era weapon with a maximum range of 10,300 meters. Anti-tank weapons were scarce. Motorized transport was virtually non-existent. The division would fight a mechanized opponent using 1918 technology and tactics. The Soviet 57th Special Corps, by contrast, was specifically organized for mechanized warfare. Its commander, Georgy Zhukov, was a veteran of cavalry operations in the Civil War who had studied mechanized warfare intensively and survived Stalin's purges that decimated the officer corps in 1937-38. Zhukov understood that the key to victory lay not in battlefield heroics, but in logistics and concentration of force at the decisive point. The nearest Soviet rail depot was at Chita, 600 kilometers from the Khalkhin Gol. Moving sufficient force to achieve local superiority required an unprecedented logistics operation. The technical challenge. The Mongolian steppe in summer 1939 presented environmental challenges as daunting as any human opponent. Daytime temperatures exceeded 100 Fan. Nighttime temperatures could drop below freezing. Water sources were scarce and often contaminated. The terrain varied from hard-packed clay to loose sand to rocky outcrops, with vegetation limited to scrub grass and occasional stunted trees. For armored vehicles, these conditions were murderously difficult. The BT series tanks, with their gasoline engines and thin armor, became ovens in daytime heat. BT tanks were easily attacked by Japanese close-quarter teams armed with petrol bottles. The Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 light tanks, operating in temperatures greater than 100 F on the Mongolian plains, easily caught fire when a Molotov cocktail ignited their gasoline engines. Mechanical reliability became a decisive factor. Soviet tank units expected 15 to 20% of vehicles to be non-operational at any given time due to mechanical failures. The BT-7's Christie suspension, brilliant for speed, was mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. The M17T engine, a licensed copy of the German WWII, required careful maintenance and clean fuel. In Mongolia's dust and heat, both were scarce. Japanese armor faced even worse challenges. The Type 95 Hago light tank, weighing only 7.5 tons, was armed with a 37mm gun and two 7.7mm machine guns. Its 120 horsepower diesel engine gave it a top speed of 28 mile radius diameter, respectable for infantry support, inadequate for mobile warfare. Armor ranged from 6mm to 14mm, proof against rifle fire, vulnerable to any anti-tank weapon. More importantly, Japanese tank doctrine hadn't evolved beyond World War I concepts. Tanks existed to support infantry, not to serve as independent striking forces. Japanese tank crews trained to advance slowly, suppressing enemy positions while infantry exploited the suppression. Against Soviet armor operating independently at high speed, this doctrine was suicidal. The Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tank, introduced in 1938, represented a step forward. Weighing 15 tons, armed with a 57mm gun and two 7.7mm machine guns, powered by a 170 horsepower diesel, giving 24 mile radius diameter top speed, with armor up to 25mm thick. On paper, it could challenge Soviet light tanks. In the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, only 4 Type 97s were deployed. The Soviet high-velocity guns and their superior range made short work of them. At least one fell victim to a tank trap, after which several BT-5s and BT-7s shot it. The fundamental problem wasn't individual tank quality, it was operational concept. The Soviets understood tanks as breakthrough weapons operating in mass. The Japanese understood tanks as infantry support weapons operating in small packets. When these philosophies collided, numbers and speed overwhelmed courage and individual skill. The initial engagements. The border skirmishes of May 1939 escalated throughout June as both sides reinforced their positions and the fighting intensified from patrol clashes to regimental actions. Soviet and Mongolian troops returned to the disputed region, and Azuma's force moved to evict them. but the Soviet Mongolian forces surrounded Azuma's force on 28 May and destroyed it. The Azuma force suffered 8 officers and 97 men killed, and 1 officer and 33 men wounded, for 63% total casualties. The destruction of the Azuma force demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet combined arms tactics at the tactical level. Soviet forces had used armor and mechanized infantry to achieve local superiority, isolated the Japanese force by severing its lines of communication, then systematically destroyed it with concentrated firepower. Japanese tactical responses emphasized aggressive night attacks, operations that would neutralize Soviet advantages in armor and artillery. Japanese battle doctrine dictated a night attack. The unexpected assault in the dark, which culminated in hand-to-hand combat, would neutralize Russian advantages of artillery and armor. The night attack on June 27–28, 1939, demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of this approach. Japanese infantry infiltrated Soviet positions under cover of darkness, achieving surprise and temporarily seizing objectives. Soviet defenders, caught off guard, suffered heavy casualties in close-quarters combat, where Japanese training in bayonet fighting proved superior. But dawn brought Soviet artillery and armor. Japanese forces occupying exposed positions were systematically destroyed by indirect fire they couldn't answer. Withdrawal under fire proved nearly as costly as the assault. The night attack had achieved tactical surprise, but operational nothing. The strategic situation remained unchanged while Japanese casualties mounted. At the end of June 1939, Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara of Japanese 23rd Division was given permission to attack. He planned for a two-pronged approach. One force aimed for Baitsagan Hill and Kawatama Bridge. Another force, including 3rd and 4th Tank Regiments, aimed to attack Soviet positions on the east bank of the Khalkhin Gol. The July offensive revealed the stark disparity in combined arms capability. The Japanese northern prong initially succeeded, driving Soviet troops from Baitsagan Hill. Zhukov launched a counterattack with 450 tanks and armored cars without infantry support. The Soviet armored force attacked the Japanese on 3 sides, forcing the Japanese to fall back over the river on 5 July. The tank battle of July 3–5 demonstrated tactical principles that would recur throughout the campaign. Soviet armor operated in brigade-strength formations, over 100 tanks attacking in coordinated waves. Japanese anti-tank guns, positioned for infantry support, found themselves engaging targets at ranges and speeds their doctrine hadn't anticipated. The Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun, effective against stationary targets at close range, struggled against BT tanks moving at 30-mile range diameter across open terrain. Gun crews had perhaps 30 seconds to acquire range and engage a target before it closed to assault range or flanked the position. Soviet tanks absorbed losses, mechanical failures, and combat damage littered the battlefield with disabled vehicles, but continued advancing with surviving tanks. Japanese infantry, trained to resist armor with close assault tactics, discovered that courage was insufficient against massed mechanized attacks. Soldiers armed with magnetic mines or demolition charges had to close to contact distance, an impossible task when Soviet tanks advanced under mutual covering fire from coaxial machine guns. On 23 and 24 July 1939, Japanese artillery bombarded Soviet positions at the Kawatama Bridge, while 64th and 72nd Infantry Regiments launched probe attacks. On 25 July, 64th and 72nd Infantry Regiments launched a major attack, but it failed to dislodge the Soviets. The Japanese suffered over 5,000 casualties in the series of failed attacks at the Kawatama Bridge region. The Kawatama Bridge attacks revealed the futility of frontal infantry assaults against prepared defenses, supported by armor and artillery. Japanese infantry, advancing in tactical formations perfected in China, encountered a fundamentally different opponent. Soviet defensive positions incorporated interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery concentrations, and tank patrols that counterattacked penetrations before they could be exploited. The casualty exchange rate was catastrophically unfavorable. Japanese forces suffered roughly 4.1 casualty ratios in failed assaults, losses they could not sustain or replace. Medical evacuation was primitive, resupply sporadic, and reinforcements non-existent. By late July, the 23rd Division was combat ineffective, understrength, demoralized, and facing an opponent that grew stronger daily. The books, Zhukov's masterpiece. While the Japanese 23rd Division bled itself white in futile attacks, Georgy Zhukov orchestrated one of history's most sophisticated logistics operations. Zhukov, using a fleet of at least 4,000 trucks, transporting supplies from the nearest base in Chita 600 kilometers away, assembled a powerful armored force of 3 tank brigades, the 4th, 6th, and 11th, and 2 mechanized brigades, the 7th and 8th, which were armored car units with attached infantry support. The scale of this operation cannot be overstated. Moving 3 divisions, 5 tank brigades, supporting artillery and combat aviation across 600 kilometers of primitive roads required precisely coordinated motor transport, fuel depots, repair facilities, and supply dumps, all while maintaining operational security that concealed the build-up from Japanese reconnaissance. To secure operational surprise, Zhukov employed many varied deceptive measures. Radios broadcast false information and transmitted soundtracks of construction noise. Trucks and aircraft operated day and night to muffle the sound of unit deployment. Such measures convinced the Japanese that the Soviets were also digging in for the winter. The operational plan was conceptually simple but technically complex. A double envelopment that would surround and destroy the Japanese Sixth Army. Soviet forces would attack simultaneously on both flanks while fixing Japanese forces in the center, achieving the classic cannonade that military theorists had studied since Hannibal. Execution required unprecedented coordination. The northern pincer, consisting of the 6th Tank Brigade, 11th Tank Brigade, elements of the 7th Motorized Armored Brigade, and the 36th Motorized Infantry Division, would strike south, cutting behind Japanese positions east of the Khalkhin Gol. The southern pincer, comprising the 4th Tank Brigade and 8th Motorized Armored Brigade, would strike north, linking with the northern force to complete the encirclement. At 05:45 on 20 August 1939, Soviet artillery and 557 aircraft attacked Japanese positions, the first fighter-bomber offensive in Soviet Air Force history. The preparatory bombardment represented the most sophisticated application of artillery science yet seen in warfare. Soviet gunners had registered their weapons during preceding weeks, noting exact coordinates of Japanese positions. Fire plans designated specific targets for specific battery assignments, command posts, artillery positions, communication centers, observation posts. The 500-gun bombardment fired over 50,000 shells in the first hour. Japanese positions simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed, dugouts caved in, communication wires severed, observation posts destroyed. Survivors emerged shell-shocked, deafened, isolated from command structure, facing an assault they couldn't coordinate a defense against. The air assault compounded chaos. Soviet bombers struck rear areas, supply dumps, artillery positions, reserve concentrations, command posts. Fighters strafed anything that moved. The I-16 and I-15 I-153 fighters, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, achieved local air superiority through sheer numerical advantage. Japanese pilots, flying mainly Type 97 fighters, couldn't contest Soviet control of airspace. Then the armor rolled forward. The northern pincer moved first, over 200 tanks advancing in brigade formation. BT-7s led, exploiting their speed to penetrate deep before Japanese defenders could react. T-26s followed, suppressing defensive positions. BA-10 armored cars scouted flanks and screened against counterattacks. Japanese defenders facing this onslaught had minutes to respond. Anti-tank guns that survived the artillery barrage engaged at maximum range, 800 to 1,000 meters, hoping to stop the advance before tanks closed to assault range. Some succeeded. Disabled BT-7s littered the approach routes, victims of lucky shots or mechanical failures. But most Soviet tanks continued advancing. The 45mm guns on BT-7s and T-26s engaged Japanese positions at 500 to 800 meters, beyond effective rifle range, but well within tank gun range. Machine guns suppressed infantry attempting close assault. The mathematical advantage of armor versus infantry was merciless. One tank could engage multiple targets simultaneously while being effectively immune to rifle fire. The speed of the triple-pronged Soviet thrust first startled, then demoralized the Japanese. From 0700, Zhukov's entire bomber force had been pounding them, and for the first time they felt the weight of the brilliantly organized Russian heavy artillery. By 0900, the advanced detachments of Russian armor were arriving in the combat area, and at 10:45, the full attack went in. The Japanese response was predictable and futile. Unit commanders, trained to counterattack aggressively, ordered localized counterstrokes that were destroyed piecemeal by Soviet firepower. The absence of motorized reserves meant Japanese forces couldn't concentrate quickly enough to seal breakthroughs. The absence of effective anti-tank weapons meant infantry couldn't stop armor even when they reached the breakthrough point. By nightfall on August 20, the northern pincer had penetrated 15 kilometers behind Japanese lines. The southern pincer had achieved similar success. Japanese forces east of the Khalkhin Gol were surrounded. Approximately 20,000 troops cut off from supply and reinforcement. The encirclement. The next 5 days demonstrated the brutal efficiency of modern combined arms warfare against an opponent lacking the tools to resist it. Its powerful armored forces, which included a battalion of SP guns and a company of flamethrower tanks, swept clear around the left and by 21 August was solidly established behind the Japanese, operating south of the Khalkhin Gol's east-west tributary, the Khasan Gol. 2 days later, the northern group, assisted by Zhukov's reserve 212th Airborne Brigade, fighting on the ground, cut its way across the Palitz Heights round to join them, and the enemy was surrounded. The Japanese 23rd Division found itself in an impossible tactical position. Surrounded by superior forces, cut off from supply, facing an enemy that controlled the air and possessed overwhelming artillery and armor superiority, the division had 3 options: break out, be relieved, or be destroyed. Breakout required mobility the division lacked. Japanese forces were foot mobile, carrying perhaps 3 days of ammunition and rations. Soviet forces were mechanized, capable of repositioning faster than Japanese infantry could march. Every breakout attempt was detected by air reconnaissance, interdicted by mobile forces, and destroyed by concentrated firepower. Relief required reinforcements that didn't exist. The Kwantung Army's nearest reserves were hundreds of kilometers away, facing the same logistics challenges that made the encirclement possible. Political considerations, Tokyo's explicit orders not to escalate, prevented commitment of forces necessary to break the encirclement. Destruction was inevitable. Japanese soldiers, imbued with military culture that valued death over surrender, fought with suicidal ferocity. The fighting was bitter and by no means over. Japanese in dugouts had to be burned out by the flame-throwing tanks, and surrenders were rare. But the Red Army too had a determination which took a heavy toll of 600 dead in the savage hand-to-hand fighting in the dugouts and gullies of the Palitz Heights as the pincers of encirclement closed. The KG-26 and OT-7 flamethrower tanks proved essential for reducing Japanese defensive positions. Standard tactics involved suppressing a position with machine gun fire while flame tanks advanced to assault range. At 60 to 70 meters, the flamethrower would project burning fuel into trenches and dugouts. The psychological effect was absolute. Soldiers facing immolation had seconds to flee or die. Those who fled were engaged by covering infantry. Those who remained burned. Japanese counterattacks demonstrated extraordinary courage and tactical futility. Small units, platoon or company strength, would assemble at night, infiltrate Soviet lines, and assault supply dumps, artillery positions, or command posts. These attacks achieved tactical surprise, inflicting casualties disproportionate to their numbers. But morning brought retribution. Soviet armor would locate the penetration, surround the Japanese force, and systematically destroy it with artillery and direct fire. The exchange rate remained catastrophically unfavorable. Japanese forces were trading irreplaceable combat power for temporary tactical disruptions.
After a Japanese relief attempt had been beaten off by 6th Tank Brigade on 26 August, all hope for the trapped troops was gone. The growing Russian air superiority alone was enough to ensure their destruction.
By August 29, organized resistance had collapsed. The 23rd Division had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The Japanese army claimed that it had suffered 8,440 killed and 8,766 wounded out of the 75,000 men committed. But actual number of troops killed might be in the 20,000s or 30,000s. The Soviet Union claimed that it had suffered 9,284 casualties out of the 57,000 men committed. But the Soviets might have understated the figure. The actual number of casualties might be between 21,000 and 24,000. The casualty figures, disputed by both sides for propaganda purposes, obscured the operational reality. The Japanese had suffered a devastating defeat that invalidated their entire military doctrine. Tactical lessons. The Khalkhin Gol campaign provided brutal education in modern warfare's technical and tactical realities. First, mobility determined outcomes. Tactically, the battle highlighted the weaknesses of an infantry-centric army fighting a conventional battle against mechanized forces in open terrain. Japanese forces, tied to foot movement or animal transport, couldn't concentrate forces fast enough to counter Soviet mechanized maneuvers. Every Soviet advance or encirclement movement happened faster than Japanese forces could respond. Second, firepower multiplied when concentrated. Soviet doctrine emphasized massing artillery at the decisive point, sometimes achieving 50 or 60 guns per kilometer of front. Japanese artillery, dispersed for infantry support, couldn't achieve comparable concentration. The mathematics were merciless. 60 guns firing simultaneously delivered more destructive power than 60 guns firing sequentially, while being less vulnerable to counter-battery fire. Third, combined arms coordination was force multiplier. Soviet attacks integrated armor, artillery, aviation, and infantry through centralized command using radio networks. Each arm supported the others. Aviation spotted targets for artillery, artillery suppressed defenses for armor, armor broke through for infantry to exploit. Japanese forces, lacking effective communication and combined arms training, fought as separate elements that could be defeated in detail. Fourth, logistics enabled operations. The war was decided not in tactical engagements, but in Zhukov's ability to sustain 3 divisions and 5 tank brigades 600 kilometers from the nearest railhead. Japanese logistics, dependent on animal transport over even longer distances, couldn't support sustained operations. This left the Japanese infantrymen armed with gasoline-filled bottles to face counterattacks by Soviet tanks and infantry supported by artillery. Fifth, doctrine must adapt to technology. Japanese doctrine, developed for operations against Chinese forces with minimal armor and artillery, proved suicidal against Soviet mechanized forces. It broke the comforting myth that morale beats firepower. Doctrine could only carry it so far when there were too few Japanese tanks and too few artillery pieces to influence decisively the outcome of the battle. The technical lessons were equally stark. Japanese anti-tank weapons proved inadequate. The Type 94 37mm gun could penetrate Soviet tank armor, but crews needed training, positioning, and time that modern combat didn't provide. Japanese infantry learned that attacking tanks with improvised weapons required superhuman courage to overcome simple mathematics. One soldier with a gasoline bottle versus a tank with coaxial machine guns was not a fair fight. Soviet forces learned that mechanical reliability mattered as much as combat effectiveness. BT-7 received baptism of fire in battles at Lake Khasan in August 1938. Then the BT-7 participated in the battles at Khalkhin Gol, where out of 493 tanks, 48 were lost forever. The difficulty of controlling the vehicle was noted, which required excellent training for the driver, and a weak bulletproof reservation, along with a massive lack of radio stations, which made it difficult to control large groups of tanks in battle. The BT series gasoline engines were fire hazards. The thin armor was vulnerable to any anti-tank weapon, but speed and numbers overwhelmed these weaknesses. The lesson was clear. In mechanized warfare, quantity had a quality all its own. The strategic consequences. The Khalkhin Gol campaign's impact extended far beyond the Mongolian steppe, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations of both nations and influencing the course of World War II. For Japan, the defeat killed the Strike North faction's influence. The Imperial Japanese Army had believed that Soviet forces in the Far East were vulnerable, poorly led, inadequately equipped, and isolated by vast distances. Khalkhin Gol shattered these assumptions. Soviet forces had demonstrated superior combined arms capability, overwhelming firepower, and logistical capacity that Japanese forces couldn't match. The strategic debate within Japanese military and political leadership shifted decisively. The Strike North faction, which advocated war against the Soviet Union to secure Siberia's resources, lost credibility. The Strike South faction, which advocated expansion into Southeast Asia and confrontation with Western colonial powers, gained ascendancy. On 13 April 1941, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was signed. This treaty freed both nations from the threat of a two-front war. For the Soviet Union, it meant that when Germany invaded in June 1941, Stalin could transfer elite Siberian divisions westward without fear of Japanese attack. For Japan, it meant focusing entirely on southern expansion, the path that led to Pearl Harbor. The tactical lessons shaped both militaries' development. The Soviet military, having validated deep battle theory, continued developing mechanized warfare doctrine. Georgy Zhukov, his reputation enhanced by victory, would become the Soviet Union's most important military commander. The techniques he perfected in Mongolia, double envelopments, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming concentration of force, would be employed on vastly larger scale against Germany. The Japanese military learned opposite lessons. Rather than accepting that infantry-centric doctrine was obsolete, they concluded that Khalkhin Gol represented exceptional circumstances, open terrain that uniquely favored mechanized forces. In the jungle warfare they anticipated in Southeast Asia, traditional infantry tactics would remain supreme. This conclusion was partially correct, but strategically disastrous. Japanese forces would achieve remarkable successes in 1941-42 against British, Dutch, and American forces in Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and Dutch East Indies. but these victories came against forces equally unprepared for modern combined arms warfare. When Japanese forces eventually faced opponents who had mastered mechanized warfare, American forces in the Pacific Island campaigns, the tactical and doctrinal deficiencies exposed at Khalkhin Gol would reappear with devastating effect. The technological evolution. The border conflicts accelerated technological development in both militaries, though with dramatically different results. Soviet tank design evolved directly from Khalkhin Gol experience. The BT series weaknesses, thin armor, gasoline engines, limited gun power were well documented. Soviet designers were already developing next-generation vehicles that would address these shortcomings. The T-34 medium tank, which would become perhaps history's most influential tank design, incorporated lessons from Mongolia. Its sloped armor maximized protection efficiency. 60 mm at 60 degrees was effectively equivalent to 120 mm of vertical armor. The 76.2 mm F-34 gun could penetrate any contemporary German tank's armor. The diesel V2 engine reduced fire risk while providing excellent range. Christie suspension provided mobility comparable to BT series while supporting greater weight. Critically, the T-34 was designed for mass production. Soviet industrial planners understood that modern warfare consumed equipment at unprecedented rates. Victory required not the best tank, but good tanks in overwhelming numbers that could be produced, maintained, and crewed by conscripts with minimal training. The KV-1 heavy tank, also entering service in 1939-40, addressed the need for breakthrough capability. Weighing 45 tons, with armor up to 90 mm thick, and armed with the same 76.2 mm gun as the T-34, the KV-1 was effectively immune to German anti-tank weapons when it first appeared in 1941. Its genesis lay in understanding that infantry support tanks needed to survive concentrated anti-tank fire while suppressing defensive positions, precisely the mission that T-26s struggled to accomplish at Khalkhin Gol. Soviet artillery development emphasized mobility and mass. The 76 mm divisional gun M1942 Zayas III became one of the war's most successful artillery pieces, combining the roles of field gun, anti-tank gun, and infantry support weapon in a single design. Its development reflected lessons about the need for versatile, easily produced weapons that could be massed at decisive points. Japanese tank development went in precisely the wrong direction. The Type 97 Chiha, Japan's standard medium tank through most of World War II, remained essentially unchanged. Its 57 mm gun was adequate against Chinese forces, but increasingly obsolete against modern armor. Its thin armor, 25 mm maximum, was vulnerable to almost any anti-tank weapon. Its 170 horsepower engine provided acceptable mobility, but insufficient power for armor upgrades. More critically, Japan never developed tank production capacity comparable to the Soviets, Americans, or Germans. Total Japanese tank production during World War II was approximately 2,500 medium tanks and 2,200 light tanks. The Soviet Union produced over 57,000 T-34s alone. The Americans produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans. This production disparity reflected fundamental economic and industrial realities, but also doctrinal decisions that prioritized other weapon systems. Japanese anti-tank weapon development accelerated after Khalkhin Gol, but never achieved parity with opponents. The Type 1 47 mm anti-tank gun, entering service in 1941, could penetrate 70 mm of armor at 500 meters, adequate against early war tanks, insufficient against improved Allied armor. The Type 4 75 mm anti-tank gun, introduced in 1944, was comparable to American and British weapons, but produced in tiny numbers due to resource constraints. The most successful Japanese response to armor threats was tactical rather than technological. Specialized close assault tactics using magnetic mines, pole charges, and suicide attacks. These tactics worked when Japanese infantry could approach enemy armor under cover or at night. Against enemies with effective combined arms coordination, they were suicidal gestures. The human dimension. The border conflict's human cost was measured not just in casualties, but in broken careers, crushed reputations, and psychological trauma that shaped both militaries' cultures. For Soviet officers, surviving the 1937-38 purges and succeeding at Khalkhin Gol meant career advancement. Georgy Zhukov became the Soviet Union's most decorated military commander, playing decisive roles at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. His blunt, aggressive command style, demanding absolute obedience, accepting heavy casualties to achieve objectives, prioritizing operational success over soldiers' lives, was forged in Mongolia. Other officers who distinguished themselves at Khalkhin Gol similarly rose to prominence. The experience created a cohort of Soviet commanders who understood modern mechanized warfare's requirements and had demonstrated ability to execute complex combined arms operations. This expertise proved invaluable when Germany invaded. But success at Khalkhin Gol didn't guarantee survival in Stalin's Soviet Union. Some officers who performed well were later purged for political reasons unrelated to military competence. Others fell victim to the catastrophic defeats of 1941, when Stalin needed scapegoats for disaster. The Soviet military's professionalism was always subordinate to political reliability, a reality that degraded effectiveness even while producing spectacular operational successes. For Japanese officers, Khalkhin Gol was professional catastrophe. General Michitaro Komatsubara, commanding the 23rd Division, was relieved and effectively exiled to training commands. Staff officers who had advocated aggressive action faced courts-martial or forced retirement. The Kuomintang Army's reputation for invincibility, earned in operations against Chinese forces, was shattered. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was profound. They had fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. They had witnessed comrades burned alive by flamethrower tanks, obliterated by artillery, run over by armor they couldn't stop. They had learned that spiritual superiority didn't stop bullets, that aggressive charges didn't destroy tanks, that dying bravely didn't constitute victory. Yet Japanese military culture couldn't fully absorb these lessons. The ideology of spiritual superiority over material force was too deeply embedded in doctrine and training. Officers who suggested that Japanese tactics needed fundamental revision were viewed as defeatists. The result was a military that learned tactical adjustments, better anti-tank weapons, improved infiltration techniques, while refusing to acknowledge that doctrine itself was obsolete. The Winter War's shadow. The Soviet-Japanese border conflicts occurred in parallel with Soviet preparations for conflict with Finland, and the two campaigns are often studied together as revealing Soviet military capabilities on the eve of World War II. The Winter War, November 1939, March 1940, demonstrated that Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol hadn't solved fundamental problems in military organization, leadership, and doctrine. Soviet forces initially performed disastrously against Finnish defenders, suffering catastrophic casualties while making minimal progress. The contrast was instructive. At Khalkhin Gol, Soviet forces had overwhelming material superiority, competent leadership under Zhukov, favorable terrain for mechanized operations, and an opponent with limited anti-tank capability. In Finland, Soviet forces had material superiority, but faced forested terrain unsuited to armor, well-prepared defenses with effective anti-tank weapons, competent Finnish leadership, and brutal winter conditions. The Winter War revealed that Soviet combined arms doctrine worked brilliantly under favorable conditions, but collapsed when those conditions weren't met. Soviet infantry, separated from supporting armor by terrain, performed poorly. Soviet logistics struggled in winter conditions. Soviet command and control was rigid, unable to adapt quickly to unexpected situations. These weaknesses would be brutally exposed in 1941 when Germany invaded. The early catastrophes, millions of prisoners, vast territorial losses, entire armies encircled and destroyed, demonstrated that Khalkhin Gol's lessons were incompletely absorbed. Victory had bred dangerous overconfidence. The doctrine of deep Battle refined. Despite setbacks in Finland and 1941's disasters, the Soviet military never abandoned deep battle theory. Instead, they refined it through bitter experience. Deep battle required several preconditions that Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol had enjoyed but often lacked later: overwhelming material superiority, extensive preparation time, adequate logistics, and favorable terrain. When these conditions existed, as at Stalingrad, Kursk, and during the 1944-45 offensives, Soviet forces executed operations of stunning sophistication and effectiveness. The refinement process added critical elements to the doctrine. First, maskirovka, military deception, became integral to operations. Soviet forces learned to conceal offensive preparations, present false objectives, and achieve surprise even when general offensive intentions were obvious. Zhukov had employed deception at Khalkhin Gol. By 1944, it was systematized across all major operations. Second, artillery became increasingly central to operations. The Soviet military developed artillery tactics that made them history's most effective practitioners of massed indirect fire. Pre-registered target zones, rolling barrages, and counter-battery fire were perfected to unprecedented levels. Soviet artillery at Stalingrad and subsequent operations was incomparably more sophisticated than at Khalkhin Gol. Third, operational planning became more realistic about casualties and logistics. Early operations often collapsed due to logistical failures or unsustainable casualty rates. By 1943-44, Soviet planners had developed systematic approaches to stockpiling supplies, organizing medical evacuation, and maintaining operational momentum despite losses. Fourth, combined arms coordination improved dramatically. Radio communication became standard at battalion level and below. Liaison officers coordinated between armor, infantry, artillery, and aviation. Training emphasized inter-service cooperation rather than individual service excellence. These refinements transformed deep battle from theoretical concept into operational reality. The Soviet offensives of 1944-45, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Poland, and finally Germany represented deep battle doctrine executed at army group scale with devastating effectiveness. The techniques first tested at Khalkhin Gol, refined through catastrophic defeats and hard-won victories, ultimately destroyed the Wehrmacht. Japan's doctrinal stagnation. While Soviet doctrine evolved through hard experience, Japanese military doctrine remained fundamentally unchanged despite Khalkhin Gol's lessons. The reasons were complex: institutional conservatism, resource constraints, successful operations in China and early Pacific campaigns, and ideological commitment to spiritual superiority over material force all contributed. Japanese infantry tactics in 1945 were recognizably similar to 1939 tactics. Aggressive offensive action, night infiltration, bayonet charges, and willingness to accept extraordinary casualties to achieve objectives remained doctrinal constants. These tactics worked against poorly trained or unprepared opponents, Chinese nationalist forces, initial American forces in the Philippines, but were suicidal against prepared defenses with effective artillery and armor support. Japanese armor doctrine similarly stagnated. Tanks remained primarily infantry support weapons used in small packets rather than massed formations. This approach worked adequately in jungle terrain where American armor struggled to deploy effectively. But when Japanese armor faced American armor in rare tank versus tank engagements, the results were one-sided massacres. The Battle of Saipan, June-July 1944, demonstrated how completely Japanese tactical doctrine had failed to evolve. Japanese forces executed massive banzai charges against prepared American positions, supported by artillery, armor, and naval gunfire. The attacks achieved nothing beyond spectacular casualty figures. American firepower simply obliterated attackers before they could close to hand-to-hand range. These suicidal tactics weren't madness, they were logical applications of doctrine that had never been fundamentally revised after Khalkhin Gol. Japanese military culture had interpreted the defeat as an aberration rather than evidence of obsolete doctrine. The successful campaigns of 1941-42 seemed to validate traditional approaches. Only when facing American forces who had studied mechanized warfare extensively and possessed overwhelming material superiority did the doctrinal bankruptcy become undeniable. By 1945, Japanese military planners understood their situation's hopelessness. American forces possessed overwhelming superiority in every category: firepower, mobility, logistics, air power, industrial capacity. Japanese defensive strategy emphasized extracting maximum American casualties through fortification and suicide attacks, hoping to make invasion so costly that a negotiated settlement became preferable. This strategy represented the logical endpoint of doctrine that valued death over surrender, spiritual superiority over material force, and tactical heroism over operational art. It was a doctrine forged in an earlier era, tested at Khalkhin Gol, found wanting but never truly revived. The frozen battlefield today. The Khalkhin Gol battlefield today is remote, largely unchanged since 1939. The Mongolian steppe remains vast, empty, and unforgiving. Temperatures still swing from over 100 F in summer to well below freezing in winter. Occasional monuments mark where tens of thousands died in a conflict most of the world has forgotten. The battlefield is littered with debris, shell fragments, cartridge casings, pieces of destroyed equipment slowly being reclaimed by rust and sand. Occasional visitors find artifacts, Japanese helmets, Soviet shell casings, pieces of tank armor. These physical remnants are the only immediate evidence of mechanized warfare's fury. The governments of Russia, Mongolia, and Japan maintain war memorials at various battlefield sites. The largest monument stands near the original Soviet positions, a towering structure commemorating Soviet and Mongolian victory. Japanese memorials are smaller, quieter, acknowledging defeat with characteristic understatement. Veterans of the battle are all deceased now. The last Japanese survivors died in the early 2000s, taking personal memories with them. Soviet veterans survived longer. Some participated in 60th and 70th anniversary commemorations, but they too are gone. What remains are the lessons, some absorbed, others ignored, all relevant to understanding modern warfare's evolution. The technical lessons remain valid. Mobility determines operational outcomes. Firepower concentrated at decisive points overwhelms dispersed firepower. Combined arms coordination multiplies effectiveness beyond individual capabilities. Logistics enables everything else. Doctrine must adapt to technology or become obsolete. The strategic lessons resonate across decades. The Neutrality Pact, signed after Khalkhin Gol, allowed both nations to pursue their strategic priorities: the Soviet Union to concentrate against Germany, Japan to expand southward. That decision shaped World War II's entire Pacific theater and arguably influenced its European theater by freeing Soviet forces for operations against Germany. The human lessons remain most disturbing. Soldiers on both sides fought with extraordinary courage for causes they believed just. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated in Bushido ideology, died bravely in futile charges against overwhelming firepower. Soviet soldiers, serving a totalitarian state, nonetheless fought effectively in combined arms operations requiring initiative and competence. Courage and competence existed on both sides, but only one side possessed doctrine and technology suited to modern warfare's realities. The legacy of mechanized warfare. Khalkhin Gol and Lake Khasan were not the first mechanized battles. That distinction belongs to various World War I tank actions. They were not the largest. The tank battles of 1941-45 dwarfed Mongolia's engagements in scale. But they were uniquely important as proving grounds for modern combined arms doctrine executed under realistic combat conditions against competent opponents. The battles demonstrated principles that would dominate the next 6 years of warfare and remain relevant today. Mass matters. Individual weapon quality is less important than numbers of adequate weapons properly employed. Soviet BT-7s were inferior to many contemporary tanks in armor and armament, but 500 BT-7s defeated Japanese forces with superior individual weapons but inferior numbers and doctrine. Integration multiplies effectiveness. Armor, artillery, aviation, and infantry must function as coordinated system rather than separate entities. Each arm compensates for others' weaknesses while enabling their strengths. Logistics determines operational capability. The most brilliant tactical doctrine fails without fuel, ammunition, and supplies delivered to the decisive point. Zhukov's logistics operation, moving thousands of trucks across 600 kilometers, mattered as much as his tactical plan. Doctrine must match technology. Japanese forces possessed courage, training, and tactical skill, but fought with doctrine designed for earlier technological era. Courage cannot compensate for obsolete doctrine against properly employed modern weapons. Speed and surprise remained decisive. Modern warfare's tempo exceeded human decision-making cycles. Japanese commanders couldn't respond fast enough to Soviet maneuvers, not because they were incompetent, but because their forces lacked mobility to execute responses. These principles, validated at Khalkhin Gol, would be revalidated in countless engagements across World War II and subsequent conflicts. The German Blitzkrieg, American island-hopping campaigns, Israeli wars in 1967 and 1973, coalition operations in 1991 and 2003, all reflected lessons first demonstrated on Mongolia's steppe in 1939. Conclusion. The forgotten battlefield. The frozen hell of Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol represents a critical hinge point in military history. The moment when modern combined arms mechanized warfare was tested comprehensively under realistic conditions and validated completely. Soviet forces had demonstrated that properly executed deep battle doctrine could achieve operational objectives with devastating efficiency. Japanese forces had learned, at catastrophic cost, that infantry-centric doctrine was obsolete against mechanized opponents. Both lessons would shape World War II's conduct, though only one side would fully internalize what they had learned. For the Soviet Union, victory validated a military transformation begun in the 1920s and nearly destroyed by Stalin's purges. The Red Army that defeated Japan in 1939 would evolve into the juggernaut that smashed the Wehrmacht. Zhukov, who perfected combined arms operations in Mongolia, would command at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, the decisive battles that destroyed Nazi Germany. For Japan, defeat presaged catastrophe. The military that refused to fundamentally revise its doctrine after Khalkhin Gol would face the United States.